Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme, and I must admit I'm fascinated to hear what my guest today is going to say. Simon Kuper is a journalist at the Financial Times and a football writer as well, and in his spare time he does have some. He's also written a book about what it has actually been like to live in Paris during the past 2 decades. I think he's been here slightly longer than I have, but I've been here for almost about the same amount of time as he has. Kuper experiencing the city both as a human being, but also as a journalist, as the city has changed around him. His book is called Impossible City, Paris in the 21st Century. And Simon Kuper joins us now. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. First of all, let's start off by being a little bit positive, shall we? Give us some ways the city you think has changed in a good way. I mean, did you have optimism, for example, when you first arrived here?
I didn't arrive planning to stay. I thought I'll just stick around for a few months and enjoy eating and then move on. I didn't really have a particular attachment to France. And now 22 years on, I'm a French citizen and my children are Parisians. So yes, these things happen unexpectedly. I am quite optimistic about the future of Paris. Firstly, because they forced the car out very largely. So as you know, it's become a city with much more cycling, with cleaner air than before, where it's easy to get around in a healthy way. And the other thing that makes me optimistic is they're starting to build and open 68 new metro stations in the suburbs of Paris, because the suburbs and the city have never really been connected together. The suburbs are where mostly poorer people were pushed out to. Suburbs now much bigger than the city, 10 million in the suburbs, 2 million in the city. And with these metro stations, it will suddenly, for the first time, be much easier than ever before to move between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that. We're looking at some very lovely, beautiful pictures of Paris while you're talking there. But of course, it's not all like that, is there, notably in those suburbs?
Yeah, I mean, most of the suburbs were built in the decades after the war. Initially, there was some very ugly tower blocks that were unpleasant to live in. Those have now largely been torn down, so the suburbs do look better. But yeah, when people think of Paris, they think of this picture postcard city inside the peripheric ring road where only 2 million people live. You know, the Paris that we all know, pictures we have in our heads. But what I try and explain in the book is that that's 1/6 of what we think of Paris.
What about within the centre of Paris as well? I mean, there are problems there too, aren't there?
Absolutely. I mean, Paris has become a kind of hate symbol for much of the rest of France. And you see that in politics as well. So the Rassemblement National doesn't get any significant votes in Paris, but is very strong in the rest of the territory. So there's this French idea that you have this bad elite in Paris, which is embodied by Emmanuel Macron, which is out of touch with the rest of the country. And the wealth gap between the two is quite strong. Problems inside Paris, I would say 2 million bad-tempered people living in apartments that are too small for them. Everybody lives very cramped here, and trying to carve out tiny private spaces for themselves on the streets and cafes in any public space.
Yeah, what do you think Paris is actually like to live in? Because I mean, as I say, I've been here for about 14, 15 years, and there are a lot of advantages and, as you say, a lot of disadvantages too.
Well, I mean, the perfection of Paris is the density, and the horror of Paris is the density. It's perfect because everything you'd want to see or meet or eat or any museum you want to go to is a short distance from your home. And you can have so many different wonderful experiences just within 5 minutes walk of your apartment in most of Paris. But then the problem is that you don't have space. I mean, it's a more densely populated city. For the book, I went through a lot of the stats, so I'm now au fait with the stats. It's a more densely populated city than New Delhi, than Manhattan, I believe. It's and you notice that when tourists come, because in Paris, you learn to take only your tiny stretch of the pavement, of the sidewalk. And a tourist will kind of spread out and take a selfie with 2 other people. And you think, you don't understand how space works in Paris.
And it's also, let's not forget, older buildings as well. I mean, you can hear quite often a lot of what people are saying, not word for word, but you can hear people talking in the rooms next door. You can hear creaky floorboards as well from people above and below as well.
Yeah, I'm speaking to you from my 19th century office. We live in a home with floorboards that creak, like most Parisians, as you say. I mean, Haussmann, who was the architect of Paris from the 1850s to about 1870, he created this beautiful city with these 6, 7-story buildings. But It's very, very noisy, yeah. And so you spend a lot of time trying to protect your private space and your intimacy from your neighbors. It's almost sometimes like you live in the same home as your neighbors. That's how close it is.
And you sort of alluded to this earlier on, but I mean, Paris has this reputation, doesn't it, as being full of very cantankerous people who moan and complain a lot. Is that really true, do you think?
I think it's becoming less true. I've already noticed in the last few years that especially younger people have become much friendlier. And sometimes you see a young person walking down the street and you pass them and they do this thing with their face, which I think is called a smile, which I've seen in Paris for the first 15 years or so here. So I think that the kind of norms of the rest of the world are gradually creeping into Paris. But there is a cantankerousness just because people are constantly getting in your space. And it makes people, I think there's a kind of cabin fever that Parisians live with, and that's quite stressful.
Would have been the turning points, do you think, for Paris? I mean, inevitably, of course, we think of the terrorist attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I write about the terrorist attacks in my book because I felt we were right in the middle of them. I was in the Stade de France on November 13th, 2015, where the attacks began. There was an explosion outside the stadium, which is now about to be the Olympic Stadium. And then most of the shooting was in our neighborhood. We live a few minutes walk from the Bataclan, where 130 people were massacred. So that was a moment when I thought, is it still possible to live in Paris? Is it going to become like Beirut, where just a few people, violent people, make the city unlivable?
I mean, there was a good year, wasn't there, where people were very, very on edge, maybe 2 years, I would say. But now, not people have forgotten about it. Of course they haven't, but you know, life goes on, I suppose.
Yeah, there were a few months where you didn't go to a cafe because the cafes were the places that had been shot up. So, you know, you weren't going to sit there and make yourself a target. So I remember months of having my morning coffee in the house, which is not how Paris is supposed to work. And then after a few weeks, people start cautiously to go back. I remember I'd go into a cafe and look around as I walked in and think, if men with guns walk in, where will I go? Where will I dive to? That's how we used to think. And you're right, over the years, that just fades away. Although now with the Olympics coming back and a huge anxiety about potential terrorist attacks, those worries are returning.
Yeah, exactly. My next question, Olympics. Again, a lot of Parisians saying, I don't want this. This is causing even more chaos in the densely packed city and saying they're going to leave for the Olympics. It's a bit of a shame, though, isn't it?
Parisians are very hard to impress because, you know, you can say to them, well, the Olympics, Paris will be the center of the world for a fortnight. A lot of Parisians think, weren't we the center of the world already? They don't need an Olympics to validate the city. And, you know, it's always been a city that tries to match itself with the greatest cities on earth. So it looks at New York and looks at London and says, we should be up there and ahead of them. And so, yeah, Parisians are quite blasé. And of course, there is always every day great sport, great art, great entertainment in Paris anyway, even without an Olympic Games. Enormous numbers of people are leaving. I think most of the excitement will be felt in France outside Paris.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly in those suburbs that we were talking about earlier, there are a lot of areas that are being redeveloped because of the Olympics, aren't there?
Well, the poorest department of mainland France, department is a kind of small region, is Seine-Saint-Denis, which is just north of Paris, which is where the Olympic Stadium and the aquatic center for the Games are. And it's true that they built a wonderful athletes village, which is going to become housing, you know, in a month or two just after the Games and the Paralympics. But if you look at the map of Seine-Saint-Denis, there's way more building going on that has nothing to do with the Olympics. There's all sorts of skyscrapers going up, office buildings, but also housing. So I actually don't think that the Olympics are the main thing that's happening to Paris. I think the main thing that's happening is the building of these 68 new metro stations in the suburbs, and then what comes with that, the building of way more new housing in the suburbs, often on top of stations. So the Olympics are kind of going to be a blip, I hope a happy blip in the history of Paris. And we're going to come out with a kind of Grand Paris, as is the phrase for the big Paris, the Paris that includes the suburbs as well as the city.
Sounds like you've got another book to write in 10 years' time to update the one you've already done. Simon, thank you very much for being with us. Simon Kuper, his book, Impossible City, Paris in the 21st Century. Thanks for joining us on the programme today.